Hello everyone, welcome to week 3. I went ahead and posted your assignment on Blackboard, and I know that I originally included chapter 7 in week 3, but I feel like we should take our time and make sure everyone's familiar with the symbology feature for all your layers and how it functions in ArcGIS and how it might apply to other GIS projects that you might do in the future or just data analysis in general. So when you get through 5 and 6, turn them in just like you did with chapters 3 and 4. And there are 8 exercises. There's not a lot to them, but that was another reason I thought to go ahead and shave off chapter 7 for this week, because that's a lot. That's plenty for 1 week. But just everybody got the gist of turning their assignments in. So just do the same thing for 5 and 6, and that'll be week 3. As far as what I wanted to focus on, or just kind of have a supplement for, using the symbology feature in ArcGIS is pretty handy, and you can do a lot with it. It looks pretty simple, and I think if you do the exercises it'll be really straightforward, but this is where the most basic magic happens, is one way to put it, with how you display your data and do your spatial analysis. And it's important to know what you can do with this feature, so that way, again, when you're considering your end user who's going to consume the data and look at the map and use it, you want to make sure that you have them in mind when you're doing these symbolizations or recategorizing your data or just manipulating it, period. And one thing for chapter 5, you're dealing with what I like to call soft data, and that is just anything that can be really subjective, or names of places like countries, just simple yes no values in a table. Those are really soft because they can change and they can mean anything, as opposed to hard data like elevations or precipitation levels, which are numbers. They're absolute values that you can measure and you can manipulate through equations and formulas, scientific methods, as opposed to the name of a place. If it's in English, it could be in a different language. And you can make up any types of characterizations, how much you like them. You can give them an arbitrary rating. And just keep in mind that's kind of the difference between soft data and hard data. There's probably more technical terms for them, but that's what I've always heard them referred to as. And chapter 5 deals with a lot of characterizations of soft data. And the only thing that really you would want to think about is if you don't have a lot of data. For example, I'm going to use the data from your 3rd and 4th chapter assignments. If you were to look at the cities that Amelia Earhart visited, your text would just tell you to go in and say, okay, if you add all the values for precipitation levels, it characterizes them, gives them colors, and then most people would say, okay, I'm done. But if you're in a situation where you didn't really know how to manipulate this data or create a new layer to put over this one to show only certain values, you could always go back into the symbolization and select, okay, for example, if I just wanted to show all the cities that had precipitation values over 1,000, then you could just select all these and go to remove. And you also need to check off all other values, because everything that you removed from the symbolization category gets put in this all other values. It's just a generic representation that says, hey, there's data here in your table, but you can choose not to show that. And then when you say okay, you notice that the data, it didn't disappear and you didn't erase it, but your symbols are gone. So now you only have 4 classes of precipitation for cities, and you didn't have to make a new layer, you didn't have to know any fancy data manipulation tricks. All you had to do was go into the symbology tool and kind of get it to where you wanted to go there. And I think that's important, because a lot of changes that need to be made to maps to make them more user-friendly or to get your point across in a better way can be done just by playing with the symbology and thinking about what you're trying to show. So and that's important, because you always want to do that first and try not to overcomplicate the process, because the less you have to mess with your data, the better off you are. And sometimes you don't have time to sit down and write out long equations or figure out how you're going to manipulate things or reclassify an entire data set. Sometimes you've got to make it look good and get it out the door, and that's why the symbology feature is really nice, because you can do that rather quickly. And in chapter 6, it shows you more of the classifications and breakdowns that you can use in the symbology tab for more like quantities and charts. And I just want you to focus on the fact that they're there, that just as you can do in Excel or Word or any other programs you might be familiar with, you can take the data that you have here and turn it into a pie chart, do graduated quantities and break them down into statistical splits and how they're divided and how they're shown on the map. And we're not going to get into that too much, but it's good to know that it's there, so that way if you are a statistician or if it's important in your research, that you can go ahead and say, well, I use the Jenks method to classify all the data on this map, and if someone knows what that is, then you're good to go. You can also there's one of the examples in the exercises is if you have your own schema to set up for the data, you can make that up too. But that's not as important as just knowing that you have those options available to you. And another thing you might want to take into consideration, and this will be on your test, so write it down on a sticky note and stick it on your book or put it next to your computer. But there's two different types of data that the book talked about, and I think I mentioned when we started. And the main classifications are raster data and vector data, and everything here is vector data: lines, points, polygons. And the reason you need to know the differentiation between those two is because for vector data, which is all of this here, there is one single entity, one line, one segment of her flight path, Amelia Earhart, one city, one point, one country, and it has all kinds of data associated with it, as opposed to raster data, which I don't have a good example for. But raster data is, you could say it's like this grid, and what it would do is it would generalize all the data that's stored within this area, and it would turn it into one square's worth of information that you can define it as the average, or whatever you need to do for your specified project. But raster data is a lot of different squares with different values, and then your graphics card, your program, it renders colors and graphics based on the values in those squares, as opposed to housing data as one point. And that's a big difference between the raster data and vector data, kind of in lay terms. There's more technical definitions for the two, but that's the main difference. And it's good to know that, especially when you're trying to classify data, because it's much easier to create symbols and line thicknesses and different colors for things like we're dealing with here, as opposed to raster data, which all you can do is just say, well, if it's 1, it's red; if it's 2, it's green, so on and so forth. So there are different situations where raster data is better than vector data, and we'll get into that later. But as far as the symbolization goes, which is what chapters 5 and 6 are over, I just know that you have a lot more freedom with the vector data to manipulate your data and how it's symbolized, as opposed to raster data. And that's pretty much it for these two chapters. Once everyone gets familiar with how these work, we're going to start working on dynamic labels and how to manipulate this data more, so that way if you've got something that you have in your tables, you could use it like an Excel table and say, well, I know that if I can make this bigger, if you know that your elevations are going to change by a certain percentage because of earthwork, or if you know that the precipitation is off by a certain value, you can manipulate all of these at once instead of having to calculate them by hand and make your own map or make a report. These tables with ArcGIS function just like Excel tables or access databases, and you can manipulate all this information. And that's kind of the stuff we're going to get into. But it's important to get the basics of symbolization down first, so that way if you need to change things like this, then you know when you get your end result how you're going to display it on your map, or whatever information you might share in the end. So just go ahead and do the 8 exercises for this week, and then I will probably I have everything graded that's been turned into me for chapters 3 and 4, and I'll try to be on the ball about getting everything graded for chapters 5 and 6. Next week we'll probably have a review over what you've been doing, and don't worry about it. I won't make the test too complicated, and I'll go over some of the things that you need to know before you get to that point. But it will be online, it will be open book, because I can't stop you, obviously, for taking an online test and having your book open. But I'll go over it with everybody to make sure you're at least mostly prepared, so don't worry about that. And as always, if anybody has any questions or concerns, just shoot me an email and I'll get back with you as soon as possible.